Thanks for stopping by Big Top Gaming. My name's Brian, and in this video, I wanted to talk a little bit about Roose Bolton, Lord of the Dreadfort. We're going to be taking a peek at his commander card and the cards that he adds to the tactics deck, and then trying to build a list around him to see if we can kind of nail down how the Lord of the Dreadfort plays. Before we get too far into talking about Roose Bolton, I did want to mention, if you're not familiar with how the new Bolton faction functions within the game of A Song of Ice and Fire, essentially they're kind of like a mini faction, so they're probably going to have a little bit more of a limited release cycle than some of the other factions. So if you're a little bit averse to getting these really wide lists and having cabinets or cases full of models, the Boltons are a decent option, at least until they decide to expand on them to that level 2, but I don't think that's going to happen in the future. The other thing about the Boltons is that they can't take neutrals, much how the free folk can't take them, and I kind of get it, and I also don't appreciate it so much. There are lots of things that I'd like to be able to do within the neutrals with the Boltons. Like, they shouldn't have, restricted access as long as everyone else has open access, so I don't know if I really feel like the reasoning behind this is super solid, but I'll trust that CMON knows what they're doing with the game they're designing, and go from there. So that's kind of the overview of how the Boltons work in general as a concept in the game. In order to understand how Roose Bolton feels on the table, let's take a look at his commander cards first that he adds into the tactics deck. The first one's going to be Whispered Threats. This triggers when an enemy NCU activates. After that NCU claims a zone this turn, after resolving that zone's effect, target one enemy combat unit. They become vulnerable. Then target one enemy combat unit. They become panicked. So the interesting thing about Whispered Threats is it's a little bit of a reactive card, but also a proactive one at the same time. You're going to be reacting to when an enemy NCU activates, so there's only so many things that can really happen when an NCU activates. They claim a zone, they do the thing, they do their card. That's the flow of how that goes. But once all of that is done resolving, and I guess you could probably get the timing a little weird on this one, since the active player gets to choose the order for simultaneous triggers. If they choose to resolve the NCU board first and then resolve the NCU ability, that could get a little bit wonky in terms of what that NCU can actually do, like if they're able to remove condition tokens. But essentially, I think most people are going to be resolving an NCU effect first, if there is one, and then resolving the zone's effect, or maybe the zone's effect won't apply. It's kind of situational, but something to be aware of, that your opponent can juggle those simultaneous triggers the way they need to. But getting back to the value of Whispered Threats, you can, after your opponent's decided to take the advantage of trying to sync some activations to see what you're going to do next, you can immediately punish them for that by putting vulnerable on an enemy unit and then panicked on an enemy unit as well. It can be the same unit if you want, but if two different units are kind of requiring two different tools, then you can put them where you can put these tokens where you need them. I feel like this is a really great follow-up for trying to do maximum damage, especially if your opponent has been feeling the attrition and is like, I'm going to claim the coin, so I'm going to heal and remove some tokens. Then you get to trigger off Whispered Threats, get that token applied again, and then punish them immediately after by activating a unit to attack that one and take advantage of the vulnerable token and panicked. So I think Whispered Threats is a really aggressive feeling card, or more like a punishing kind of card. Not so much on the controlling side, but definitely controls the attrition battle that happens between combat units. The next card that Roose makes available to a Bolton force is Seeing Their Flaws. This triggers after an enemy combat unit completes an action. That enemy becomes vulnerable and panicked. You then attach this card to that enemy until the end of the round. While attached and Roose Bolton's unit is attacking that enemy loses all abilities and cannot be targeted by friendly tactics cards. So we can see a continuing theme with Roose Bolton so far, that applies vulnerable and panic tokens to try and make the most out of the attacks that are directed at the unit you're fighting. The extra bit here with Roose Bolton's unit stopping the defending model from using any abilities or tactics cards that it might have is one of the things that I think is going to help you figure out how you want to build the rest of your list, or at least the part that is putting Roose Bolton on the table and in a unit. Do you want to have Roose be a lot more aggressive and deal with the sides of the table? Or are you wanting him to kind of go into the middle to hold an area and just exist on a point? And that way, if your opponent's bringing in defensive things or things that can move other units off of the table, then you have the ability to get some extra damage through and have less influence from your opponent coming back at you in order to keep that unit around. The final card that Roose brings to the Tactics deck is going to be Dreadfort Secrets. This triggers after a friendly unit completes a melee attack if it destroyed an enemy rank. You attach this card to one friendly infantry unit within short range of the attacker. All enemies they are engaged with become panicked. While attached, each time an enemy unit activates in short range, that enemy becomes panicked. So Dreadfort Secrets is a pretty straightforward card with a few interesting applications. You can kind of really manipulate how you want this card to work for you. If you're the unit since your unit made the attack and destroyed an enemy rank, they can be the available target to attach the Dreadfort Secrets to, so that if you've gone before the enemy does, you've burnt that panic token to do some damage and get that rank to come down, you can throw Dreadfort Secrets out. And then when your opponent activates that unit to try and retaliate, they're going to get panicked again, which can set them up for more damage later on. But you can also kind of waterfall this out and say that the unit that deletes the rank can then have another friendly unit within short range get this, and then maybe the opposing unit that they're engaged with activates, then gets that panic token, and then you can start doing some damage if your opponent's not wanting to attack whatever originally killed ranks, right? So I think I might have jumped through a lot of hoops to try and get that to work or explain it, but I hope that came out all right. But otherwise, I think Dreadfort Secrets is, in the long run of the game, if you go in, haven't killed the unit that you connected with, you're at least able to try and get some more panic tokens out so you can start rotating through these. So a Roose Bolton-led Bolton list can be very panic efficient. You're going to take some damage for it, but I think we can build some ways in to try and make sure some of those wounds come back. Overall, I think Roose Bolton does a really good job, at least within his tactics cards, to help turn on the tactics deck a little bit more. Thinking about things like Our Blades Are Sharp, where if the defenders happens to be panicked, you can re-roll attack dice in addition to having your precision as normal. And then making sure that your opponent really might not be extremely interested in trying to get a bunch more panic tokens on units you might not have been able to touch through sadistic games means that they're going to be they're going to be taking hits from that card instead. Also, using cruel methods to make sure that you've got these panic tokens on tap to be able to exchange to vulnerable or weakened if you want, but mostly I think you'd be doing things like, it's probably between vulnerable and getting some healing going, because the Boltons, some of their units aren't the most defensive in the universe. So I think that Roose really plays well into he leans into what the Boltons are wanting to do and enables that a little bit better. So I think he brings some really cool and interesting things to a Bolton list, even if he is a little bit more of I wouldn't say a far cry, but he's a lot different from his neutral version. They still share one card, but I feel like Roose Bolton neutral is much more control-y, whereas this version of Roose Bolton is much more killy and makes sure that things go down fast. Let's move on to Roose Bolton's attachment to see where he's going to end up landing within the list that he's leading. So the Lord of the Dreadfort ends up bringing the order Spread Fear. This triggers when an enemy engaged with this unit fails a panic test. You target one other enemy unit in long range of this unit. It suffers one panic test with -1 to their roll for each remaining rank in this unit. On a failure, it suffers an additional wound, or +1 wound. So Spread Fear is a really fun ability. Well, I shouldn't say fun, but it's a good ability. And when I first see it, the thing that it makes me think of is that I want to put Roose Bolton into a unit that's survivable and wants to get into the mix of things. Because even though there's some access to healing within Roose's list, or a Bolton list, we don't have access to neutrals like Tycho to be able to try and get some extra healing to make sure that this unit stays full up. So you kind of have two different directions you can go with Spread Fear. You can either pick a unit that's really durable, or you can pick a unit that is so efficient at killing that you're really not too worried about the extra damage that might be coming back at you. Finally, Roose Bolton also adds to the unit Intimidating Presence. This is an ability that just states enemies engaged with this unit suffer -1 to morale test rolls and +1 wound from failing panic test rolls. So we had talked earlier about all of his tactics cards kind of adding to this killy nature, making sure we're getting panic tokens and vulnerable tokens, and then the Boltons themselves within their base tactics deck have a lot more ways to ensure damage gets through. So having Intimidating Presence means that when you're putting your damage in, you're not just being able to get the most out of these panic tokens, but having that -1 modifier and an additional wound means that it's quite easy for you to start taking down ranks and enabling other parts of your tactics deck or army rules or unit rules, really, and making sure your panic tests that your opponent's taking go the extra distance with that +1 wound. So taking all of that into consideration and how I appreciate playing the game, I'm going to look towards the Blackguards for making a home for Roose Bolton. For 6 points, we end up getting a fairly slow unit at movement 4 that has a 3+ defense save and a 6+ morale. So just with that, they're pretty survivable. They're not getting extremely aggressive other than just taking a bunch of walk turns early. So this might be one you might want to target with the maneuver position on turn 1 in order to get into a place where they're not taking forever to get to where they want to be. But they also have some good offensive capabilities. They hit on 4s, which isn't the most amazing, but with some of our cards in the tactics deck, we can make our hits a little bit more reliable. And they have a 6/5/4 decay stat, so they don't have that nice sweet spot of super aggressive where they're throwing 7 dice. And when you're hitting on 4s unaided, you're likely on average, right, if you believe in averages on dice, to hit 3 of those attacks with being unaffected by anything. But those attacks are valuable in that Spiked Flail is one of their Spiked Flail has the Vicious ability, so that'll be -2 to panic test rolls for your enemy when they go to the panic test stage. And then Roose Bolton's Intimidating Presence makes that -3, so it's pretty easy for your opponent to be failing panic tests, even if they have a little bit above average stat. These guys will be able to do quite a bit of work, and with precision being something that's accessible within the Bolton faction, you won't have too much of a hard time getting to that panic test. So their offensive capability through just raw attacks is a little bit lower because their performance on the panic side is much higher. Speaking of that, they also have the ability Horrific Visage that states each time an enemy performs a melee attack on this unit, before resolving that attack, target the attacker. They suffer 1 panic test with -1 to their roll for each remaining rank in this unit. So as I talked about with Roose Bolton and Spread Fear, I want him in a unit that's more survivable. A 3+, 6+ is going to be able to provide that to us, but the Blackguard themselves want to be pretty survivable as well to make sure that they get maximum effect out of Horrific Visage. So you also get that compounded with Intimidating Presence as well, because now it's almost like they have an additional rank all the time for that panic test. So your opponent is going to be extremely punished for coming into this unit, not just because of the damage they can do from the forward-facing attack that they can put out, but also for Horrific Visage. It'll make it so your opponent's also less likely to want to take the combat zone against this Blackguard unit, and with them being survivable and holding like center points, it'll be difficult for your opponent to contest you on these, because any unit they put into you, unless they're really tuned for survival, are going to have a hard time getting through the Blackguards. And with some of the cards that Roose Bolton brings, if you're making it so that you're ignoring their abilities and tactics cards, this makes it so that it's really easy for you to tear apart some of these units that are specifically tuned to handle units like this. And I feel like that puts the Blackguard in a really high position in terms of where I want to put Roose Bolton. Since Roose Bolton is taking up residence in a slower unit, I wanted to make sure I added some further influence to the list, or outreaching influence. threat range, maybe you want to call it that. And so that I'm grabbing our tried and true flayed men. So for 8 points, we get a cavalry unit that is speed 5, and they bring a war flail attack that hits on 3s and has a 6/4 decay. They have that 3+ save and 6+ morale. And the war flail ability that they have is vicious, so we have more like panic test modification. And also when charging, it gains critical blow, so that 6 attacks can be a little bit a little deeper in terms of its effectiveness, because every 6 you get, you're going to be adding in an extra hit to that. They also bring the intimidating presence ability that Roose Bolton has. Just to reiterate, enemies engaged with this unit suffer -1 to morale test rolls and +1 wound from failing panic test rolls. So these guys essentially have a -3 swing on their melee attacks for getting through to panic. So if you're looking for precision or just trying to get some extra hits in, they can do quite a bit of damage through on their panic tests. You do want to be aware, don't fall into the trap of thinking that the flayed men can come kind of rescue Roose Bolton out of a situation and take advantage of a double intimidating presence thing. There's a caveat in the rules and in the FAQ that states that intimidating presence, since it's the same name ability, it does not stack. This doesn't stop you from getting like the -1 from like a corpse pile or something, so you could have like a total of -4 with someone with intimidating presence, but those two abilities won't stack and give you an extra -2 and +2 damage extra on the failed panic test. The flayed men can still do that, can fulfill that role by coming to rescue Roose if he's in trouble, because with the cavalry move and their extreme speed and the fact that Roose would be engaged with something else, it's quite likely that they'll be able to get a side charge, and that's where you're going to be doing a lot of extra damage. So flayed men are an easy pick for making it into my list. So far with the units we've put into Roose's list, we have seen a little bit lower on the upfront melee output for these units. We're really trying to look at getting the damage to go through on the panic side. So one of the other units I want to make sure I grab and get into this list is going to be a unit of Dreadfort Archers. For 6 points, we get a speed 5 unit that has a long-range attack called Ruthless Volley. It hits on 3s and has a 7/7/4 decay stat. They also have a short sword that hits on 5s and then has a 5/4/3 stat, but that's really not what we're taking them for. They have a 6+ defense save and then a 7+ morale. So this is a unit you really don't want into the mix of things, but having that long range is going to make sure you don't have to do that, because on their Ruthless Volley attack, it states that it ignores units in terrain when determining line of sight. And then when attacking engaged enemies, you gain precision and can reroll any attack dice. Your friendly units engaged with that enemy suffer 1 wound though, so again with Roose Bolton and the flayed men specifically, they're not too worried about taking some extra wounds from this attack because they're already quite survivable unit themselves. So really you're just trying to be able to enable more damage. 7 dice hitting on 3s with precision means that you're quite likely to get something to go through, and if you're targeting a unit that's engaged with either the flayed men or the blackguard with Roose, you have that intimidating presence there to help you out as well. Now, I am adding an attachment to this unit because I do feel like this particular attachment almost seems like they're going to live in a archer unit for the rest of eternity, and that's going to be Sour Allen. This is one of the Bastards boys. He costs 0 points with this business because I think it's the first Bastard boy you include in your army is free. So what Sour Allen adds to the archers is the brutal sadism ability. This works for both ranged or melee. Well, and melee, I guess. It's both. Before rolling attack dice, you choose one of these things. The attack gains critical blow, sundering, or the defender becomes panicked. After completing the attack, if you didn't destroy an enemy rank, the attacker suffers 2 wounds. So your archers are going to lose some wounds if they don't end up removing ranks with this attack. But you're not too worried about it because they have a 7/7 decay. So I think it's 7/7/3 or 7/7/4. I already forgot what I said. 7/7/4. So you can pick the mode for their archer or for their ruthless volley, that's going to help get them the most value out of it. Now, critical blow is kind of fishing for things, but if you're engaged with someone, being able to reroll those dice, you might be able to fish out some sixes to get some extra damage on a lower save unit where that's really going to help you out. Sundering can get into those more armored targets that Roose or the Flayedmen might be chewing a little too long on, and then just giving panicked when they don't have it is helpful as well. So I think Sour Allen just is he really is kind of feeling like more of an auto take with these archers for me, because he can elevate the power of their ranged attacks so much and make sure that you're plowing through the units that have decided to crash into the lines of your Roose and Flayedmen. At this point in the list build, I'm still feeling a little low on the real upfront aggressive melee output that this army can bring, so I've decided to reach for 2 units of Cutthroats. These are 5 points. They're extremely cheap. Their movement is 5. They have the Ruthless Aggression melee attack, which hits on 3s and then has a 7/6/4 decay stat. So it decays real hard after that last rank is around, but I really want that forward-facing melee capability out of them. They have a 5+ defense save and a 7+ morale save, so you're really not wanting to have these be the first thing that your opponent crushes into. You kind of want to lead out Roose and maybe the Flayedmen to kind of absorb that blow when you need to, and then these can come up and clean up afterwards. With their Ruthless Aggression attack, they bring Vicious, so they also are going to be getting that great panic save modifier for your opponent. And then when attacking enemies that have not yet activated this round, you can reroll attack dice and the defender becomes vulnerable. So they kind of have their own baked in thing with trying to add condition tokens to your opponent. And the way that the vulnerable token ends up working out is that you can use it on the attack that you take, because it's just when you're attacking enemies. You don't get to that, like, you don't have to wait until after this attack's resolved type thing. So these guys can be really brutal when you have the top of the turn, or if your opponents had to make hard choices in terms of what to activate next. Now, with these units being 5 points each, we definitely have some wiggle room for being able to add attachments to make them a little bit more effective. And it can get a little weird when you've got a unit that is not as survivable where we're with that 5/7 stat. So I can see some people maybe shying away from attachments on them, but I do want to add Steelshanks Walton to one of these units. For 1 point, we get the Order Sentinel, which just states after another friendly unit in long range is attacked, this unit performs 1 charge or maneuver action. If charging, it must target the attacker. So an extremely aggressive unit, if it happens to be on its own or wants to get into position to where you're kind of threatening Sentinel and say, like, you know, they're coming in on Roose Bolton's unit and you just want to get these guys up a little further on the side so that you punish your opponent, where if they decide to charge into Roose Bolton, they're going to eat a charge from these on the side. It's quite a beneficial thing to do. It takes some setup and sometimes your opponent has to fall for that trap, but if you can make it work, it can pay off huge. You also get the ability Roose's Vassal, and the unfortunate thing with Roose's Vassal is the only thing that this is really going to apply to for you is seeing their flaws. I don't believe there's anything else that's in the Bolton list right now that is going to make Roose's Vassal really do anything more than that, but it's still not a bad ability to be able to shut off those tactics and abilities on an opponent's unit to make sure you can get some extra damage through. I am also getting a little bit greedy with the second unit and adding an attachment on them as well. This time we're grabbing another Bastard's Boy, and this one's going to be Damon Dance for me. Simply, he just adds the ability Boldness and Courage to the unit. That states each time this unit attacks, if it has full ranks, it gains +1 attack die. Otherwise, it's treated as having +1 rank for attack dice. Damon also has like maybe a place on archers to turn them into an 8/7/7, so they're always really dangerous up until the last drop. But with the House Bolton Cutthroats, they're now just called Bolton Cutthroats here. But with the Cutthroats, that turns them into an 8/7/6, and that is pretty effective. Your opponent can never discount this unit from being able to do work, so I feel like having Boldness and Courage on the Cutthroats, pulling them up to a 6-point unit, makes them really strong at having such an amazing, reliable, effective attack stat. So he is definitely one I'm attaching to the unit. That rounds out the combat units that we're going to be adding to this army. So moving over to the NCUs, the first one that's kind of non-negotiable for me with this list is going to be Ramsay Snow Redhelm. For 4 points, we get an NCU that has the ability Sadistic Butchery. It is an influence that states, when influencing a friendly unit, its melee attacks gain fueled by slaughter. Fueled by Slaughter is, after this unit completes a melee attack, if the defender suffered any wounds, it restores 1 wound plus 1 additional wound for each of the defender's destroyed ranks. So with Roose and the Flayed Men and even the Cutthroats putting out so much damage on Panic, having someone with Fueled by Slaughter is going to make sure that that unit sticks around for a long time. Think about things like the Horrific Visage, where your opponent's going to be taking a lot of damage from the Blackguard, and then having the ability to just end up getting more wounds back into Roose's unit after completing a melee attack is going to make sure that you're keeping them around for the long run. And Ramsay lets you juggle this wherever you need it, so I think he's almost essential to a list that has this kind of focus. So this final NCU slot is a difficult one, or at least one that you've got some options if you want to mess around with. I've decided to add Tybalt, Master of the Dreadfort, for 4 points here. We get the Deceitful Envoy ability that states Tybalt begins the game with 2 order tokens on him. Each time an enemy NCU activates, you may remove 1 order token from Tybalt. If you do, target 1 zone. If that NCU claims that zone, after resolving that zone's effect, 1 enemy combat unit becomes vulnerable. If that NCU does not claim that zone this turn, at the end of the turn, Tib will claim that zone instead. So I think Tybalt can be a difficult NCU to balance. Like, you want to maybe, like with the pass token thing, or not pass tokens, but with the pass mechanic existing in A Song of Ice and Fire right now, just kind of forfeiting an activation by having Tybalt claim a zone on your opponent's, at the end of your opponent's turn can be pretty rough. But the thing about Tybalt that I like the most is that if you can telegraph, like, which your opponent, like at certain points in the game, you're just going to understand what zone your opponent's really going to want to take when they activate an NCU. But with Tybalt, you can kind of play some funny shenanigans to try and mess with your opponent's positioning. So think of something like your opponent starts their activation. They're definitely going to want to go for the combat position on the tactics board because they're engaged with something and want to get that free attack so you don't get it. So if you go ahead and say, all right, when you activate, Tybalt is going to try and say if you take the maneuver position, then all this stuff happens, right? Like that, the maneuver is the one you pick. So they go in for their attack, then you can do something like either retreat that unit out at the end of the turn, or you can do something like get your Flayed Men into a point where they move and then can charge the back of someone and get that -5 to the panic test because you're stacking Vicious, the rear charge, and Intimidating Presence, and that's enough to do quite a bit of damage to someone. So there are some interesting mini games that you can play with Tybalt, but I think that this last NCU slot is pretty fluid in that some of the NCUs for the Boltons are not really auto picks, like one is better than the other. I think Ramsay is really, if you're not having him as your commander, I think that's kind of his opportunity cost, in my opinion, is that you don't get his NCU. But Wall de Frey is decent if you like the extra abilities that come with taking very specific zones on the table. She's very Shira Errol in that way. But I could also see doing something like dropping Steelshanks Walton if you're not a real big fan of the Sentinel Order, and then taking Tybalt and turning him into Jenny Poole so that she can get that +2 morale and then just kind of swipe a first turn out from your opponent. So I think that it really is kind of like whatever flavor you really enjoy for the NCU slot here. But Tybalt is where I like to try and mess around with, is who I like to mess around with in this slot, since he can do some of these weird mind game shenanigans. And I think that paired with Steelshanks can put it can put some stress on your opponent to make it so that they have to really think about what they're doing in their activation instead of just setting their eyes to kill and going to play the game they want to. Like, I feel like there's a lot of value, and it's like not apparent value, but there's definitely value in making your opponent have to stress over what you're going to do if they decide to choose to do something. Like that's, and I know like that kind of sounds weird because your opponent's always going to have repercussions to what they do, but these have very overt, like if you do something, there's a whole host of things that could happen that will really make this difficult for you. So that's why I like Tybalt. Thanks for making it to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed this one. It was really fun for me to get familiar with A Song of Ice and Fire again and talk about this. I do really enjoy the fact that the Boltons exist as a sub-faction, or not sub-faction, but a mini-faction. That concept's always been really interesting to me when I look over at a full glass case that's got nothing but free folk in it. So having a smaller footprint or a smaller catalog to pull from is a little bit refreshing. And I really do hope to make more Ice and Fire videos in the future. I know I've kind of fallen off the radar for a bit, but my ability to get games in regularly has lessened quite a bit. So I just wanted to make sure that I was able to provide people with educated or informative topics of discussion here. So if you are interested in seeing something else from me in the future, or want, to offer suggestions on what to do in the future, feel free to put those in the comments section below. Otherwise, I'm still really interested in the game. It hasn't fallen out of favor for anything else. It's just for lack of being able to get these games in regularly and speak from a position of intelligence and practice, instead of just kind of pulling this stuff out of my butt. So thanks a lot for sticking around. I look forward to seeing you all in the next video.